Since I'm a scientist, an ecosystem scientist, I'm not going to dispute Will's facts, but I'm going to more argue that the Anthropocene is not necessarily a bad thing for humanity, that we can actually improve the planetary niche of humanity. So how I respond to the charges are that, yes, humanity has pushed Earth out of the Holocene, but a little bit, so what? That humanity can prosper in the Anthropocene. The Earth has varied in the past. There's no reason why it can't vary in the future. That humanity actually has substantial capacity to cope with tipping points. We've coped with them in the past, and while they are likely to occur in the future, they do not represent catastrophic change for humanity. And that rather than incrementality being dead, actually incrementality is what we need to cope with a turbulent, novel world. If we expect things to be unexpected, the last thing we need to do is to have radical change. We rather need to learn how to adapt through experimentation and the encouragement of diversity. So I'm going to support these in a bit of shorter time than Will, because of course humanity has been around a shorter time than the Earth. Another way of looking at the Anthropocene is from a human perspective. This map shows what my colleague Earl Ellis and others have produced, which is an anthropogenic map of Earth's biomes, what they call anthromes. So thinking about that Earth is actually occupied by people, and it's been occupied by people for a long time. At the bottom, you see that most of the Earth's surface, terrestrial surface, is used. A smaller part is semi-natural, such as rangelands, and a smaller part, mostly in center of deserts or the poles or in the boreal forest, is more wild. This change of the Earth hasn't been an accidental perturbation of the climate system, which Will was largely talking about. This is something that's been essential to our rise as a species, to our culture, and our well-being. And a lot of this change has been sustainable over a substantial period of time. More recently, human development, thinking about both the material consumption of people, but in particular health and life expectancy, has increased throughout the world with a few exceptions. So this transformation of the planet has provided real benefits for humanity. One particular example of this, which sort of contradicts this issue of we're reducing the resilience of the Earth, is that while disasters have increased, the damage due to disasters has increased, the number of people affected by disasters has increased, the number of people dying from disasters has decreased. The picture on the right here is this example of a storm shelter in Bangladesh. Over the last 40 years, Bangladesh has substantially decreased the impact of hurricanes or cyclones on Bangladesh. People in this room probably remember the 1970s cyclone, which killed maybe about 1 million people. A similar cyclone hit Bangladesh a few years ago, where a few thousand people were killed. It's not that these things are not dangerous, but people have a substantial capacity to cope, even without massive interventions. We've had a number of ecological surprises, which are real novel surprises in the 20th century. A few of them, just the evolution of pests and pathogens to biocides, like DDT and all. The biomagnification of toxins, such as DDT, mercury, dioxin. The emergence of diseases from agriculture, malaria and river blindness due to modifications in ecosystems, and the destabilization of ecosystems by the removal of top predators. These were all surprises that humanity managed to cope with and continue to have a substantial increase in well-being, and we've largely figured out how to respond to these over the 20th century. Will mentioned this idea of IPAT, and I feel that while this concept is not wrong, it's fundamentally mistaken. It views humanity as a negative impact on the biosphere rather than as part of the biosphere. You can sort of simply think about burning the same amount of oil. You can either cut down a tree or replant a tree. So it doesn't measure the quality of the interaction with people. An example of this is maybe people are familiar with or not, is the terra preta in the Amazon. There's these anthropogenically produced rich soils in the Amazon that for a long time people thought were natural. Turns out they were done by pre-Columbian agriculture that increased the productivity and resilience of soils in the Amazon, and these are sustainable. So human impact on ecosystems doesn't have to be negative either for people or the biosphere, and that we can enhance and restore the ecological capacity of the Earth and we can enhance its diversity, enhancing the niche for humanity rather than decreasing it. So we've been talking about the future by thinking about the past. And I just sort of want to pivot a little bit here, because so evidence from the past says one thing. In the past, we've said ecosystem services has gone down and human well-being has gone up. We've been able to cope with previous crises. So Will brought up the idea, well, maybe things are different in the future. Maybe we're going to hit limits. And people are probably familiar with these discussions which have been going on since before I was born. But future trajectories, as limits to growth talked about in the 1970s, are shaped by social ecological interactions. They depend upon what we believe about the future, as well as the physical operations of the Earth system. And one of the ways I like to think about this is based on this quote from Canadian-American science fiction writer William Gibson, that the future is all around us, it's just unevenly distributed. And what you can think about this means is there's a lot of different futures that are lying around us, and which ones dominate depends upon what we do and how the world interacts. So one point from Steve Pulaski and his group, is back of the room, is that we have a lot of capacity to do better with ecosystems. There's a lot of discussion about trade-offs between, in this case, between the use of ecosystems and conservation. That's this purple curve that Steve showed up here. It's the idea that we could trade off these things and get more or less of one another. What Steve's group showed is where we actually are is not on this trade-off surface. So what this means to economists is that we're just stupid. And what it also means is there's a lot of opportunities to do a lot better where, between those red arrows, where we can improve both of these things without being worse off. Of course, there may be other factors involved here, but just the point, we can do a lot better with how we manage ecosystems without trade-offs in many cases. That with tipping points, that actually if you think about things in terms of social ecological systems, these tipping points become a lot more manageable. This is an example of colleagues and I looked at agricultural hydrologically mediated tipping points. So these range in scale from farm fields up to the monsoon systems that Will and John Schillendover talked about. But in these systems, while you can have external drivers, the presence of people who can manipulate things in the system can increase the resilience of these systems to external shocks. So for example, in the Sahel, people can reduce their vulnerability to dry spells or droughts by improving the moisture holding capacity of the soil, which can also sequester carbon. So about incrementality. So one way of thinking about environmental management is to think about what do we know about how the world works and what can we do about it, whether by manipulating the world physically or socially. We've done lots of stuff to think about how to optimize things, and that's got us into a lot of trouble when we're dealing with things that we don't know how they work and they're not so controllable. But when we don't know how things work and they're not controllable, we don't necessarily want to have radical transformation. Rather, we want to build our resilience. We want to have experimental management to learn how to do things, and we want to have new ways of thinking. So I would argue that incrementality is not dead. Rather, incrementality should be encouraged, and a lot of diversity of incrementality should be encouraged. And you need that before you can have any huge transformations. And this kind of incrementality can build local capacity that can respond and cope despite global failures to deal with these drivers of change. Finally, bringing this together a bit, a few years ago I was involved in the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, which was a big UN-sponsored assessment to try and think about what are the benefits people get from nature and how could these benefits change in the future. And thinking about the future, we looked at all these things that are around and said there's lots of ways actually we could have a pretty good future. Not without losses to biodiversity, not without changes to the planet, but something that can be good for humanity. And out of sort of 4 scenarios, thinking about different ways of approaching things, of managing global public goods better, managing these tipping points better, managing local trade-offs between ecosystem services better, you could get, in many different ways, better futures, shown in this yellow, and avoid something which would be maybe you could call a business as usual future, but would be a business as usual future without listening to anything, which is largely what these IPCC scenarios are. They're sort of a bit assuming that there's no feedback to what humanity actually does, either locally or globally. Finally, I would argue that despite all our problems, a lot of our problems actually hide the potential for solutions, that we have a large latent capacity for civilizational resilience. Inequality and well-being show that we could change radically the size of our economy and probably maintain the same amount of well-being in the world. Just a concrete example of this, people are probably familiar with recent economic studies of the US that show that almost all the gains of the US economy in the last 30 years have gone to the top 1%. So in other words, you could be at the size of the 1970s economy with basically 99% of the population having the same well-being. That there's substantial room for feeding the world better, with improvements of agriculture in Africa and Eastern Europe, Central Asia, that could be done in a way without substantial negative impacts on humanity while feeding a lot more people. And finally, to think about urbanization is that locally we've already transformed our urban environments, changing the temperature, changing the biogeochemical cycles, changing the fauna, more substantially than we're expected to change the global climate over the next at least 50 years, probably over the next 100 years. So changing our urban environment provides a huge lever to mitigate these effects of climate change on us, as well as that cities are this sort of leverage point in the Earth system. And there's many people in the room. I see Jeff West right now who's worked on cities. I see Steve Pulaski, who can hopefully talk about some of these points in the discussion. So with that, I'll conclude and just say my response to these sort of charges is yes, humanity is out of the Holocene. It's in the Anthropocene, but we can actually improve the functioning of the planet. It's not guaranteed, but we can do this. There are likely to be ecological changes, tipping points, but these are not necessarily going to be catastrophic from a human point of view. And we have a lot of capacity to cope with this and navigate these changes, as we evidenced in the past. But I would argue that this needs maybe a bit more incremental change rather than huge attempts at transformation which might fail. Thank you very much.